worse. If something is worse, it is of poor quality than another thing. If something is worse, it is of poor quality than another thing. The weather today is worse than yesterday. The weather today is worse than yesterday. Her Spanish is bad, but her Italian is even worse. My Chinese is bad, but my English, no. Her emotion emotional intelligence quotient emotional emotional quotient emotional quotient emotional quotient is worse than we thought. Emotional quotient. His emotional quotient is worse than we thought. His emotional quotient is worse than we thought. If the rain gets any worse, we'll have to go back. If the rain gets any worse, we'll have to go back. If the rain gets any worse, if the rain gets any worse, we'll have to go back. Heat. The heat is worse in the daytime. The heat is much worse in the daytime. Much worse in the daytime. Terrible. Something is terrible. It was bad. It is very bad. It is really very bad. Terrible. Terrible. She had a terrible accident. Terrible. If something is terrible, it is very bad. She had a terrible accident. She had a terrible accident. The food in that restaurant is terrible. The food in that restaurant rest 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 restaurant is terrible. Rest Run. Run. Terrible. Terrible, very unpleasant or serious of low quality. Very present, serious of low quality. The weather was terrible. The weather was terrible. We have just received some terrible news. We have just received some we have just received some terrible news. I felt terrible last night, but I feel fine this morning. I felt terrible last night, but I feel fine this morning. I felt terrible last night, but I feel fine this morning. The restaurant was terrible. I'm never going back there again. Most of these women are very poorly paid and work in terrible conditions. Most of these women are very poorly paid and work in terrible conditions. I've got no sense of rhythm, so I'm a terrible dancer. Rhythm. Re, 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 rhythm, re, rhythm, 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 rhythm. I've got no sense of rhythm. I've got no sense of rhythm. So I am a terrible dancer. I'll be bummed that last piece of work you did was terrible. Blunt. I'll be blunt. I'll be I'll I'll be blunt. Blunt. La last piece of work you did was terrible. She had a terrible accident. She had a terrible accident. The food in that restaurant is terrible. The weather is terrible. We have just received some terrible news. We have just received terrible news. Some terrible news. I felt terrible last night, but I feel fine this morning. Most of these women are poorly paid and work in terrible conditions. I've got no sense of rhythm, so I'm a terrible dancer. I'll be blunt. That last piece of work you did was terrible. Last piece of work you did was terrible. Blunt. She had a terrible accident. The food in that restaurant is terrible. The weather is terrible. We have just received some terrible news. I felt terrible last night, but I feel fine this morning. Most of these women are very poorly paid and work in terrible conditions. Most of these women are poorly paid and work in terrible conditions. I've got no sense of rhythm, so I am a terrible dancer. I will be blunt. That last piece of work you did was terrible. Worse. 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 Oh, hot. Um, worse than. The weather today is worse than yesterday. His emotion quotient is worse than we thought. Worse than we thought. Her Spanish is bad, but her Italian is even worse. It's worse than uh, if the rain gets any worse, if the rain gets any worse, we'll have to go back. If the rain gets any worse, if the rain gets any worse, we'll have to go back. His his manners are even worse than her sister's. Manners 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 manners. His manners are even worse than her sister's. The heat is much worse in the daytime. His manners is much worse than his sister's. Even worse, or even worse. His manners are even worse than his sister's. If the rain gets any worse, if the rain gets any worse, we'll have to go back. Terrible, unpleasant, serious, or low quality. She had a terrible accident. She had a terrible accident. The food in that restaurant is terrible. The weather is terrible. We have just received some terrible news. We have just received some terrible news. I felt terrible last night, but I feel fine this morning. I felt terrible last night, but I feel fine this morning. Most of these women are poorly paid and work in terrible conditions. I've got no sense of rhythm, so I'm a terrible dancer. I'll be blunt, 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 blunt. I'll be blunt. That last piece of work you did was terrible. Worse.